This is a continuation of the reading of the book by Richard Hoskins called War Cycles, Peace Cycles. As this content is related to the broader scope of understanding macro and geopolitics, I felt this to be appropriate to include as part of the Interchain FM podcast. Enjoy.
Chapter 10. Templar Wealth. As mentioned before, many devout Christians left their estates to the Templars in their wills. In every country in the West, from Denmark to Ireland, from Spain to France, local Templar organizations over the years accumulated wealth. Their skill at arms made them the natural traders of the day, and their honesty made them trusted bankers. A merchant in England might ask the Templars to transfer a certain amount in gold to Paris to cover a business deal. A Templar courier would take a gold deposit receipt to the Paris temple. This piece of paper allowed the merchant's Paris business contact to collect the agreed upon amount of gold. Sometimes he did collect, sometimes he only collected the paper gold deposit receipt, which was as good as gold. He could use this paper receipt as paper money if he chose. Merchants anywhere would accept it. Any settling up by actual transfer of gold between the London and Paris Templar temples could be done at a later date. Interest-free loans were made to kings and merchants, and trade was largely in their hands. The Templars were the wealthiest organization in existence in every country. This wealth was the reason for the Templars' downfall. Templars destroyed. The people of France forced their king to expel the Jews in 1306, just 16 years after they had been expelled from England. As in England, the French king was in debt to the Jews and was their servant. Consequently, the same sort of agreement was worked out as in England earlier. They were allowed to take almost the entire floating supply of coins with them in exchange for their extensive property holdings. This made the king a gigantic property holder, but left France with little money with which to honor the foreign commitments. What was left of the remaining supply of gold and silver money was in the hands of the Templars. To get the Templars' gold, the Templars in 1307 were charged with heresy by Pope Clement V, a French pope. Templar leaders were seized and imprisoned. Their property was confiscated. The cash went into the empty coffers of King Philip of France. Their lands were seized by the Catholic Church. In every Christian country, the word went out to seize Templar wealth. It was in this way, without being convicted or even heard, the noblest of the Christian orders was extinguished. Noble knights bearing scars of a score of battles with the infidel in the Holy Land begged bread or hid in the forest. Those who gave to those unfortunate men were excommunicated. The Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake. In recent years, there have come certain detractors who accuse this organization of taking, quote, interest. One of the best replies to this charge is found in Thomas Parker's book, Knight Templar in England, page 71. Had there been any grounds at all for a belief that the Templars engaged in usurious activities, such a charge would surely have been included in the indictment drawn up against them at the time of their arrest and trial. The lesson to be gained from this tragic occurrence is that, to survive, it is not enough to have a noble cause and to be pure and righteous. If you are wealthy while the government is poor, the government will find a way to take your wealth. In the process of seizing your wealth, they may also liquidate you to prevent future claims. The problems associated with the violation of our common law descend to the present day. The priestly tribe of Levi was to receive no land, but was to live on the tithe from the other tribes of Israel. Even though their motives were good, the wealth accumulated by the Knights Templar priesthood was in violation of this rule and aroused the jealousy of powerful enemies. The accumulation of wealth by this priestly organization caused their destruction. The great wealth in land and gold accumulated by the Roman Catholic Church through the centuries has constantly brought it also into conflict with national governments and has caused its destruction in many lands. In England, the Queen is head of the Anglican Church. Much of her wealth was confiscated from the Catholic Church. This has been a never-ending source of irritation to her subjects. Her opponents maintain that if she is to be of Levi, she should obey the rules of Levi. If she is to be of herself, she should abdicate as head of the Anglican Church and be of herself. There is no grace without repentance. The law applies to everyone, especially the king. Section 4. An abolition of usury in the West. Chapter 11. Canon Law on Usury. In early days, all Christians belonged to the Catholic Church. the Catholic Church had many rulings on the subject of usury. These rulings were incorporated into canon law. The law started with the Bible, were added to by laws of ancient Rome, added to again by the Orthodox Church of the Eastern Roman Empire at Constantinople, and were improved upon extensively during the 1100s, 1200s, and 1300s, when some of the finest ecclesiastical thinking took place. At that time, there were two types of courts. Civil courts tried civil cases. Ecclesiastical courts tried offenses against divine law, such as crimes of heresy, sacrilege, adultery, perjury, and usury. Usury was considered a violation of Scripture, against the natural law, and therefore against God himself. It was forbidden by both the divine and canon law. Prohibitions against usury were not only directed against those who took usury, but against their families, those who refused to denounce them, and those who had any part in drawing up contracts, whether or not they were lawyers, notaries, or judges. Penalties were directed against those who rented houses to usurers, which allowed them to pursue their trade, and the rulers who allowed them to reside within their territories. This included priests who did not enforce the church's edicts against these offenses. A priest was not allowed to receive their offerings. The old excuse that the money has committed no sin would not stand in an ecclesiastical court. If a usurer brought offerings to a church and disappeared, the church was required to restore the money to the victims from whom the usurer had exacted the money. In 1179, the Third Lateran Council laid down the three prime penalties for manifest usurers. 1. They were deprived of communion. 2. Their offerings were refused. 3. They were denied Christian burial. This law was interpreted to mean that the offender was not even to set foot in church during divine services. Pope Alexander III stated that if the usurer did not cease his activities, he was to be excommunicated and cut off from all intercourse with other Christians. In 1212, the Council of Paris decreed that the property of a usurer was to be confiscated by the king upon the usurer's death and distributed to the poor. The usurer was denied the right to will anything to his own family, since the fruits of a robbery were not to be the object of a gift. Once the charge of usury had been established, the ecclesiastics must undertake to make restitution to those who had been defrauded. Servants must leave the employ of a usurer or suffer the same penalty as their master. The same council declared automatically excommunicated any minister who granted Christian burial or accepted offerings from these outcasts. The Council of Lyons in 1274 stated that if a stranger who was a foreigner was accused for 1 month and had not been removed from the territory, the whole territory fell under an interdict. A wife of a usurer had no right to anything that he might give her. It was considered better that she leave him and beg bread than for her to receive support from her husband. After being excommunicated for 1 month, the sacraments were to be refused to his wife and family if they remained with him. All the faithful must within a month denounce a creditor or face excommunication. A cemetery where a usurer was buried was placed under an interdict, and no one was allowed to enter until the body of the offender was removed and disposed of elsewhere. Lawyers were not only forbidden to draw up usurious contracts, but they were also forbidden to defend usurers. Clement V at the Council of Vienna in 1311 and 1312 declared that any public official, whoever he was and whatever rank he held, was to be excommunicated if he had anything to do with drawing up a law compelling debtors to pay usury or denying them the right to recover usury. Any such law drawn up was decreed to have no force, since it was in violation of the law of God. Another type of law forbidden was a law prohibiting usury past a certain percent. The reason for this was that it would lead the unthinking to believe that usury at a percent less than the prohibited amount was all right. The Council of Vienna affirmed the law that those who proclaimed that usury was not sinful were to be punished as heretics. The decree was not only against usurers, but against anyone who encouraged the practice of usury by stating that it was not a sin against God. The basic church teaching was that anyone who paid usury could seek restitution. Borrowers could always demand the return of usury. Not only is the usury not owed, but the usurer could not receive or keep it without committing sin. The most interesting thing about these opinions is that the church forbade usury simply because it was forbidden by the Bible. So far as I have been able to ascertain, there was no real understanding of the economic benefits that accrue to a society that is free from the usury contract, such as the absence of wild economic booms and devastating collapses, bankruptcies, and unemployment. It does show the spiritual maturity of our grandfathers who, without knowing the reason for prohibition of usury, still enforced the divine law of God, and profited mightily in doing so. Usury almost completely disappeared from the Christian West. Chapter 12. The Renaissance. The universal prohibition of interest unleashed the mighty Western Renaissance. Usury had acted as a rope which had been strangling the West. As soon as it was banned, the West broke forth into a flowering which could not have been imagined earlier. Italian merchants became wealthy enough to travel to China with their goods. Spanish and Portuguese explorers were financed and uncovered continents with which to trade. Money for the development of inventions became available. The Michelangelos, Rembrandts, Shakespeares, and Newtons were supported by the growing wealth of the West, and they did their thing and made it profitable. This was an era free of interest. Circulating money. Tallies were a very important part of the economic system of the Middle Ages. Anyone who had the power could issue them. The Hanseatic League was a confederation made up of scores of independent German cities. They had the power to issue tallies, and they did. So did virtually every county and large city in Europe. The hard pocket money was gold and silver coins. Many of these coins were in poor condition, being worn, clipped, and some counterfeited. This seemed to make as little difference than as it did in Roman days. People cheerfully accepted them in payment for goods and services. Why not? The government accepted a clipped coin as readily as a full-weight coin for taxes. Not so the foreign merchants. When they made a transaction, they want a payment in full-weight gold coins. Thus, we have two kinds of coins, quote, discount coins for the citizens and, quote, trade coins for the merchants. Paper money of large denomination was simply a gold deposit receipt. A bank had, in the manner of the Templars, taken in a store of gold and issued a paper to that effect. The paper bore the stamp and guarantee of the bank. The gold belonged to whoever presented the paper. Few people will carry around 5 pounds of silver coins or 2 pounds of gold coins in their pocket, when a piece of paper which is light and portable will serve the same purpose. Of course, the peasants always wanted their 1 or 2 coins in hand instead of a piece of paper. They still do. Since, quote, interest was not present, there was no compelling reason to issue more, quote, gold certificates than there was gold reserve. It was to everyone's advantage to keep the system honest. In addition to gold deposit receipts, there were other kinds of large denomination money. It might take the form of a deed to a house, a business, a ship, or some other sort of debt-free equity, which had an accepted value in the marketplace. To make this paper money more readily acceptable, it was often guaranteed by a bank that had investigated and found that this boat or that house was indeed worth so much money on a certain day, and in public recognition of that fact, attached their seal for a small fee. This deed was used as paper money and had worth. It was not a mere, quote, promise to pay.